Welcome to Subject to Interpretation, a podcast which takes us deep into the topics that matter to professional interpreters. I'm your host, Maria Ceballos Wallis. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the De la Mora Institute of Interpretation with a special series recognizing the accomplishment of those individuals who have shaped this industry and are still sculpting its future. Today, on what we affectionately call our Founder Series, we speak with Holly Mikkelson, a true trailblazer in the field of court interpretation and legal translation. For close to 40 years, she has trained and formed professional court interpreters directly through her courses as a professor in the Graduate School of Translation, Interpretation, and Language Education of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. Also through her presentations, outreach, and workshops through NAGIT, the American Translators Association, and other international organizations, and indirectly, but consistently, through the Asebo training materials she created when this industry was in its infancy. Materials which have been used by hundreds, if not thousands, of interpreters, yours truly included. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you here, and thank you very much. You are now Professor Emerita of MIS, as some like to call it. Can you tell us what that is and what you're doing these days?
Well, that's just an honorary title. Basically, I get a parking lot sticker and library privileges. They invite me to lunch once a year, but I don't usually go. It just is a way of thanking people who have taught for many years and honoring them. It's not all that rare when people retire from a faculty, but still, I'm honored by it. I was a professor of professional practice, meaning that I didn't have a PhD and I didn't conduct research. I did write a lot, but I didn't conduct empirical research. So I think I'm glad that they had that category of professor of professional practice, because I think it's necessary in a school of interpreting and translation. You need to have practicing professionals to teach students rather than pure academics who don't necessarily practice the profession that they're teaching.
So on that tack, could you estimate how many students have taken your courses or workshops or use your materials over the years?
No. The Institute's own master's programs, probably in the Spanish English sections, had 40 students at a time. I didn't teach all of them. But then I had summer courses and short week-long intensive courses, and dozens of people took those over the years. But as far as using the materials goes, I have no idea, because they were adopted for courses being taught throughout the United States and in some other countries also. And a lot of people just bought them for self-study. So I don't know, but I imagine it's a lot of people, and I'm glad that that's the case.
So let's go back to the beginning. You received your Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Mills College in 1974 and decided you wanted to go forward with a master's, but you weren't sure what you wanted to do next. Can you talk to me about that period in your life?
Well, I did speak Spanish and French, but I didn't want to be a language and literature major. And as far as I was concerned, that was the possibility. If you were going to continue in academia, you were going to teach literature or study maybe linguistics or something like that. But I wanted to do something more practical. I discovered that I wasn't cut out to be a social worker. And so the school had a catalog, those old-fashioned books that listed all the courses at different universities. There was a catalog for what was then the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies, and they had courses in translation And I thought, well, I could be a translator. I've always liked languages, and that's a more practical application of the use of languages. And I know you're going to ask me about this, so I'm going to tell you the story. The summer after my freshman year of college, I went to Mexico to do volunteer work, and I saw a box of cornflakes that said hojuelas de maíz on, in addition to the word cornflakes. I think it was Kellogg's. They were selling it in Mexico, but they had the box translated. And I thought, well, I could do that. Somebody must have been paid to do that translation work. And I don't aspire to translate great literature, but maybe I could be a commercial translator. And I took a summer course in Monterey. My husband was at the Defense Language Institute in the Air Force. He was studying Vietnamese. And I just thought, this is really interesting. It's something practical I can do. And I discovered interpreting at the same time. I learned that the difference between translating and interpreting is the difference between oral and written communication. And I thought, well, yeah, I could be a UN interpreter. You know, I could imagine myself standing between two presidents and saying, he says this and she says that. I had no idea what interpreters actually did, but I learned when I took that course at Monterey. And then my husband got out of the Air Force. We were in Monterey, and I thought, well, I'll just continue here. So I started the master's program at the same time that they had a new professor come in and start a whole degree program in translating and interpreting. Her name was Etilvia Arjona. Eventually, she went by the name Etilvia Arjona Chang, and she was a graduate of the Geneva School of Translation and Interpreting, and she really professionalized the translating and interpreting courses at Monterey. So I took the classes there. I got caught by the bug of interpreting. I just thought it was really fun. I like public speaking, even though I'm an introvert. I love translation because of the introverted nature of the work, surrounded by your dictionaries and looking for just the right term to translate something. But I also liked the interpreting of being able to tell people stories, being able to relate a message from one language to another. I really liked the challenge of that. So I did both of them. I discovered how woefully inadequate my Spanish and my French were. So I focused on Spanish because being in California, I knew that was a more practical language to be using. And I graduated from that 2-year master's program. And what was available in the area besides translation work, which you could do it was done by mail. I worked on a typewriter and got my translations in the mail and mailed them off to the clients afterwards. So it was all very slow by today's standards. But what was available for interpreters was working in the newly formed Agricultural Labor Relations Board. California had enacted a law allowing farm workers to organize unions, and the Labor Relations Board held hearings when there were accusations of unfair labor practices. So I started interpreting in those proceedings, and again, I discovered how inadequate my Spanish was because the Spanish spoken by the farm workers was not the Spanish that I had heard in practice sessions in class when we worked with the speeches given at the United Nations and other organizations that were delivered by professional politicians. They weren't always great speakers, but they were well-educated public speakers. So I learned the Spanish spoken by the farm workers. I was constantly challenged by the bilingual attorneys who worked with the farm workers, and it was a trial by fire. I really had to get up to speed very quickly. I did a lot of crying in the bathroom and a lot of driving to assignments. I'd be hoping that nobody showed up and they canceled the whole thing. But eventually I figured out the game. I also started working in court because the same lawyers who did the proceedings in the ALRB also sometimes represented the farm workers or other people in court. So I went to court and started interpreting those proceedings. And I learned as much as I could about criminal procedure. I didn't know anything about it. And so I started reading up. I'd be ordering books from the local booksellers, and they had no idea why I was ordering this stuff. You're a translator? Why do you want to know about the law? But to me, it was fascinating. So that's how I learned. And at the same time, I was teaching part-time at Monterey because there weren't very many people who could do that kind of teaching. And it wasn't that I knew all that much, but I knew just slightly more than the students who were a year or two behind me. So I recognized that for those in the Spanish-English combination, they needed to learn about local interpreting opportunities. They weren't all going to go to the UN or to Europe. And those who were going to stay in the United States needed to learn about court interpreting.
So did Monterey at the time actually have anything that was geared toward court interpreters?
No, nobody even heard of court interpreting as a profession. And so they taught conference style interpreting, including long consecutive, where you'd listen to a speech for 10, 15, even 30 minutes, taking notes, and then deliver a version of that speech in the target language. So that was the method that I took into these hearings and court proceedings, and realized right away it just wasn't working. I saw another interpreter who was going practically word by word, interpreting the testimony with all the uhs and ums and the pauses and the self-corrections. And I thought, oh, well, we were told not to do that, but I guess you have to do it in court. So I started developing materials to train students in Monterey to do that in their consecutive classes. We would teach long consecutive also, but we'd devote a certain time during the semester to interpreting question and answer dialogues. And that was how I started developing the materials. And within a few years, I started offering summer courses for people who didn't want to get a master's or couldn't afford to get a master's degree, and they wanted to become certified court interpreters. So that's how I started developing those materials.
Now, it sounds to me like prior to you joining, Miss, there hadn't been any exposure of the faculty and even the students to court interpreting, which is something that you brought, more attention to over the time that you were not just studying there, but after, when you stayed on as an adjunct. Why do you think it was so difficult for them to think that court interpreting, or to dismiss court interpreting so easily, rather than think of it as what we know today to be an intrinsic part of language access, the justice system, et cetera?
Well, the conference interpreters who worked at the schools of interpreting, Monterey was one, Georgetown was another. Those were the only two in the US, and the others were in Europe. They focused on interpreting for international meetings. And there were plenty of those in Washington, where Georgetown was, and there were plenty of those in Europe. So they interpreted for the delegations from the different countries, or if it was an international medical conference, for example, they'd interpret for people who would deliver speeches about the research they were doing or about their country's healthcare system or whatever it was. So they were always interpreting in a booth for people who were delivering speeches. And if occasionally someone asked them to interpret in a court proceeding, they kind of looked down on it because these were criminals. These were people who were from the lower echelons of society, and they didn't necessarily know the kind of language that was used. And at the time, there were no standards. I think a lot of times if a court had a foreigner who was a defendant, they'd look for a lawyer who spoke that language and just relied on the lawyer to tell the defendant what was going on. They didn't provide interpreting services. So defendants got, if anything, a summary after the fact. They found you guilty or whatever. I mean, they didn't know what was going on. And the pay, if there was any, was dismal. So the conference interpreters didn't want to have anything to do with that. They were busy fighting for their own standards, to have interpreters working in teams in the booth, to have standards of how long someone would interpret at a time, about the study materials they were to be given in advance to prepare. And none of that was provided in court. So they looked down on it. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. And in the United States, there weren't that many international conferences going on, and there was lots of court work going on with defendants who didn't speak very much English. So there was just a need for it, which was recognized by the late 70s. States like California, New York, and New Mexico were passing laws requiring standards to be upheld and testing of interpreters. And the federal courts, by 1978, the Court Interpreters Act was passed by Congress. So people were recognizing that this was a basic right of criminal defendants, and they started implementing those standards of practice, including testing.
So let's set the, let's set the stage for this kind of unique time in history, which you were privy to. First of all, we're talking about the mid to late 70s, and I guess you cut your teeth working with the labor hearings. Before we go into everybody's favorite Interpreters Act of 1978, I did want to let people know that you had a very special time, or I guess a very special moment, where you interpreted for somebody that was crucial to that whole era in the labor movement in California. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I did have an opportunity to interpret for Cesar Chavez. Not that he needed an interpreter. He was bilingual. He was a great public speaker. And he was speaking at a conference held at Asilomar, California, which is right near Monterey. They have a conference center there. And there were a lot of English speakers in the audience who didn't speak Spanish. He chose to speak Spanish because he was proud of his Spanish speaking ability. There were a lot of Spanish speakers in the audience too. So they decided to have an interpreter, and he could speak Spanish and I could interpret it into English simultaneously. I don't remember if they had a booth set up or not, but it was one of the easiest assignments I had because he spoke so beautifully, slowly and clearly. And his message was known to everyone anyway. I was familiar with what he was going to say. So it was not a difficult assignment at all. It was an honor to be able to interpret for him. I had a similar experience with Rigoberta Menchú later on in the late 80s, maybe. She was a Guatemalan indigenous person who worked with UN agencies after the Guatemalan Civil War and all those horrible atrocities that happened. So I was asked to interpret for her. And she also was a beautiful speaker of Spanish. I think she spoke an indigenous language too, but her Spanish was native, I think. Anyway, she spoke clearly and slowly about crimes against humanity. And it was, again, another honor and privilege to be able to interpret for her. It wasn't particularly difficult. The most difficult interpreting I did was with people who were poorly educated and who did not speak standard Spanish and were expressing things with raw emotions about what had happened to them. And that I found much more difficult and more challenging. But the two famous people that I interpreted for were really highlights of my career, I could say.
I think that a lot of people, a lot of interpreters share, that with you. We like to tell war stories about things, gone wrong and everything else. But usually the ones that we hold dearest to our hearts are the ones where we have, been in a place, in a moment in time that just supersedes, that's just beyond anything we could have imagined. So I think it's wonderful that, you are able to share those stories with us. In addition to that, you just were really in the right place at the right time, because as you said earlier, you had finished your master's in 1976, and now we've got we are teaching at MIS, and we've got in 1978 President Carter signs the Court Interpreters Act. But California was also extremely active in professionalizing interpreters. What was going on there that I guess in a way you got caught up in?
Yes. Well, there was a law passed about requiring interpreters to follow certain rules of ethics and to demonstrate their skills by taking a test that was administered by the State Personnel Board. And they started testing in 1978 before the federal exam actually got started. The law for the federal courts was passed in 78, but it took them a while to put the exam together because they had a commission or a panel of experts who developed the exam. But California was a little bit earlier than that. And they developed this exam with the aid of Spanish professors and bilingual attorneys. And they didn't know anything about interpreting. They didn't know anything about testing, that sort of skill. So it was a pretty amateurish exam. For example, the simultaneous part of it, it was all delivered live. There were no taped recordings. So they would just read a script, and they were told that if the interpreter fell behind in the simultaneous exam, they should just stop and let the interpreter catch up. They didn't have any kind of what they now consider to be a list of possible correct interpretations and a list of erroneous interpretations and how many points they would take. There was none of that. It was all very subjective. Yeah, this person was pretty good. Let's pass the person, or nah, let's not pass them. It was really amateurish. I left after interpreting that thinking I had done a terrible job. And unbeknownst to me, I was one of the better candidates, and they asked me to, the following year, be an examiner. That was how I discovered how amateurish it was, because I was serving on the panel of examiners, which did finally include interpreters, but they still didn't have any kind of objective test-taking standards in place. So we were just told, stop if they don't catch up. If it appears to you overall that they meet minimum standards, then you pass them. So that was the way it was in the late 70s in California. Fortunately, it became much more professionalized, and they raised the standards of what it took to be a qualified interpreter after that. So by the 80s, I think California's exam was possibly as rigorous as the federal exam. People would differ with that, but it got better. So I took that exam, and by 1979, maybe the federal exam was ready to give. So I took the first one of those and passed that. My certification is dated 1980. So I think I probably took the exam in 79.
And you passed it the first time around?
Yes, yes. And it was no big deal. It was just another test. Everybody was testing all of a sudden. Our local county courts had their own test. For some reason, I guess they didn't respect the state board, and they wanted their own standards in place. So they didn't know what they were doing either. But I took that test. I just took whatever test came along. And so at the time, I didn't know the federal exam was going to turn into this big deal where if you didn't pass it, you felt like you were a total failure. And if you did pass it, you were the queen of the world. There was none of that yet.
So how did you prepare for these tests, for the California exam and also for the federal exam? Were there any materials for you to use at that time?
I went to the first conference that the California Court Interpreters Association gave in Los Angeles. Right around the time the state began its testing, they wanted to help their members prepare for that test. I think maybe Los Angeles had developed its own test for the county courts. And there were people who were staff interpreters who knew a lot about interpreting. They were really good interpreters. They had high standards there. Frank Almeida, Sophia Soler. I don't remember the names of all the interpreters there, but they created a manual, which I used to study to find out about the role of the interpreter and the ethics. The exam didn't feature any of that. The written exam that you took to qualify for the oral was just, I think, vocabulary and reading comprehension. And that I was good at because my Spanish was pretty strong by then, and I have always read a lot in Spanish and English. So I didn't have any trouble with the vocabulary and the reading comprehension. What was difficult for me was the oral part. And they did provide practice. They gave workshops and vocabulary lists and things that people could study. So I studied everything I could get my hands on. And I was working every day by then in court or in hearings. So I was pretty ready for the exam. The federal exam also was very similar to what I was already doing. And I was using materials to help my own students learn how to interpret in the court style of interpreting. So since it didn't seem like that big of a deal, I don't think I studied particularly hard other than reviewing terminology lists. But it was what I was doing all the time.
So now that there was this need for court interpreter training, did you feel vindicated after, all those years at MIS, and that, you had kind of, opened the path towards court interpreting being, one of the disciplines that was taught there?
Well, I don't think I had really emphasized it that much. I mean, this was shortly after I started teaching myself. This was 78, 79, 1980. I hadn't been teaching that long. So it wasn't like I had been this crusader advocating for training court interpreters for years and years. It was just something that I recognized was happening as it was happening. And I think we were at Monterey, we were on the ground floor. Etil Verjona, who was the head of the program and my mentor, was also on the panel that developed the federal exam. So a lot of what that exam consisted of was also what she had taught us in our classes, memory exercises, and she taught us simultaneous interpreting in a certain way that I really related to. And the materials I developed were based on the way I had learned to interpret in simultaneous with the shadowing and paraphrasing, and the memory exercises for consecutive. That was what we had done when I was a student there. And I think that was the approach she took to developing the federal exam. She didn't do it single-handedly. There were other people who had their own input, but I think that probably helped that my mentor was one of the people who developed that exam. And so I think that I just increased more and more the emphasis on working in the local community. I was also doing medical legal evaluations for workers' compensation cases. So I did medical interpreting, and I didn't realize how different it was from clinical medical interpreting in hospitals, which I had never done. And then eventually in the, I don't know, late 80s, mid 90s, I guess it was, California decided to test what it called medical interpreters, but it was really medical legal interpreters. And that was why I developed a manual, the Interpreters RX, to help people prepare for that exam. But I never practiced or developed materials for or taught straightforward medical interpreting in healthcare environments. So throughout the 80s, I was teaching primarily court interpreting with a little bit of medical thrown in here and there.
But you started to expand upon the materials you yourself used to prepare for the exam and that you used to help train your students at around 1978. And the materials that have made you a household name are called Asebo.
Mhm.
As most people like to say it in English, Acebo. Tell us
Yes.
about, first of all, what does Acebo mean, and how did you come up with that name? And let's talk a little bit about that journey.
Well, Acebo means holly, and apparently it's not a very common plant in Latin America. It's actually a surname in Spain, not a common one, but there's a Virgen del Acebo in Spain. But anyway, I had a freelance translation interpreting business. My husband was a technical writer at the time, and he came up with the idea that I could call my business Asebo. And we called it Asebo Language Arts in the beginning. And I had a little business card that had a holly sprig with the name Asebo. And then when we started publishing the materials, the reason that came under the head of Asebo was that I was constantly photocopying things for students. And then after they left either the master's program or one of these intensive summer programs, they would ask me for copies of the materials because they lost them, or for whatever reason, they wanted to have more materials to study, or they were asked to teach a course and they didn't have anything. So I was always mailing photocopies to people. And my husband said, "Why are you doing this? We could be selling this." So he came up with the idea of putting them, first it was a 3-ring binder, and formatting them so that they would look professional, and he was into desktop publishing and technical illustration and writing of various things. So we published them. We took out the language arts and just called it Acebo. And amazingly, people started asking for the materials from all over the country. And we've discovered that the 3-ring binders didn't hold up too well in the postal service. So then we started using a bindery that actually produced bound books, and things got more and more professional looking. And that was thanks to my husband. None of this would exist without him. So he eventually started working with the materials providers, the printers and publishers, And he started working with the customer base and dealing with sales. And a few times over the years, we did appear at conferences and had a table. He would be there selling books. He didn't like that aspect of it very much, but that was how the book started spreading all over the place. It was first by mail and then by appearing at these conferences, and it was word of mouth. We didn't do much advertising, and that's how it spread. Then people started coming and saying, well, I'm a Korean interpreter or a Chinese or Japanese interpreter, and I'd like to develop those materials in my language. Can I do that? And we would work with them to provide the look of the materials. You would have so many consecutive lessons, so many simultaneous, so many site translation, and we would do the desktop publishing part of it. We would oversee the recordings, and then they would either get a lump sum for their part of the work, or they would get royalties as we sold copies. None of them ever sold very much, but that was how the other languages came into being.
So were you involved in any of the original recordings? Because I remember speaking to you about it, and you said that a lot of it was kind of homegrown recordings at the beginning.
Yes, we did some at the Monterey Institute campus. I remember there was a motorcycle in the background and people clumping up and down stairs because it wasn't a soundproof studio. There was one where my son was practicing the piano in the background. It was our voices, my husband and me, and friends, students, family. It was a variety of voices, and they were all very amateurish. Eventually, we did start recording them in studios and improving the production values. So the early recordings, and it was all on cassette tapes, were pretty primitive. But eventually, we started selling CDs, and they were a little bit more professionally produced.
One of the things that I liked about the Asebo materials is that in many cases there are Spanish, for example, in the English Spanish, there are Spanish tracks which are versions of what an acceptable interpretation would be. Now, were those planned out in advance, or were those done on the spot by an interpreter who had to just, do the best they could at the moment?
Yeah, well, no, they were planned somewhat. The first Interpreter's Edge had glossaries at the end of each chapter for all the lessons. So there would be suggested translations of key phrases in all three types of lessons. And I liked that. That was the way I preferred to approach it, because I didn't want to give one interpretation to give people the impression that there was only one way to do it. But people kept asking, I want the answers. I want you to tell me how to site translate this text or how to interpret this recording. And so when we developed the Edge 21 series, my husband had the idea of me recording an interpretation. And at the time, everybody had stereo CD players, so they could turn down one side or the other and listen to only the source, or listen only to the interpretation, or listen to both at once. And part of it was for the simultaneous part, so that they could hear the décalage, the lag between the source and the interpretation. So I recorded all of those interpretations. And it was really difficult because I would stumble, I would fall behind. And so I did cheat, basically. And I had disclaimers all over the place saying this is only one version. And bear in mind, Spanish is not my native language. You may hear an error here or there, but I can assure you that this is good enough. This is enough that you can perform at a level that is sufficient for people to be able to rely on you. or at a level that is sufficient to be able to pass the exams, but it's not perfect. And invariably, people would send me emails and say, well, I don't like the way you interpreted this, or why did you say it that way, or you made a mistake. And so I pointed them again to the disclaimers, and I will never do that again, because I felt pressure to do a really good job on these recordings. And it wasn't that easy. It was not spontaneous. If it had been, there would have been a whole lot more stumbling and more errors in them. So I felt like I had to produce something that was better than acceptable. And to do that, I did start and stop and re-record a few times.
Well, I mean, it goes to reason that you would need to do something like that, because of course, as interpreters, we are often right on the ball, and there are times where we are not as accurate and we're not as fluid as we would like to be.
Yes.
And of course, perfection is the enemy of the good. And
Yes.
when you overthink things, sometimes that makes it even worse, right?
Yes, and I do. In one of the recent interviews that I did, I said, interpreting is the art of good enough. And I really emphasized that to students over the years. You don't have to be perfect to pass the exams. You have to be good enough. If you make a mistake, don't fall apart. Just keep going. You'll be good enough. And that sounds like a defeatist attitude. You should always strive to be perfect, but you have to know that you're not going to achieve it. And that's really difficult. Interpreters tend to be perfectionists, and they want to be perfect. But if you think that you have to be perfect or you're a failure, you won't be able to perform. And especially for test taking, I tell people you have to take a strategic approach to it. And you have to accept that you are going to make mistakes, but keep them to a minimum. And by all means, don't get hung up on something. You have to leave it behind and keep going.
Well, I recently interviewed Tina Matilski, and we did talk about the same topic. The importance of acknowledging that inner voice that's, critiquing critiquing your work, and then saying, what, that's fine. I've acknowledged it. I know that, it didn't come out as perfectly as I would have liked it to, but let's move on and let's just keep on going with what we are doing. So I think that's really, really good advice.
Yes, I often, after an interpreting assignment, I would drive home and I would get a bad case of the should have said's. I should have said this. I should have said that. I should have done it this way. And it's good because you improve, but it doesn't help your ego much.
Now, the Acebo materials began as a tool and turned into a business, but probably ended up being more a labor of love. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, yes. I mean, we did make money as the products continue to sell, and we didn't have to invest a whole lot in advertising, and we created them in our spare time. So there wasn't a monetary investment that went into it, but there was a tremendous time investment. And it didn't occur to me to go and try to get a bank loan and present a business plan or to try to get a government grant. I just did it in my spare time. It's the way I do things. I am kind of a loner. I like to just get things done and not have to rely on a lot of other people. That's not always a good thing. But that was how those things were produced. And I'm glad that we did it that way. I've worked with other people on curriculum development, and sometimes it never does pan out. They start with great intentions, but they have a whole lot of people working on different things, and some have more time than others to devote to it. And sometimes the effort just sort of runs out of gas. Other times it does produce really good work, but it's at a lot of time and a lot of expense. It's usually with a big government grant that has a lot of strings attached to it. And I don't like to work that way.
Now, you yourself has said that the Asebo material could stand to be updated
Yes.
to modern times. I mean, it was written a very long time ago, and it does, thematically and in its, I guess, structurally, it serves a very, very good purpose, because it really allows you to be focused and disciplined about how you study and how you do your practice. But what about the content? How do you feel about that these days?
Well, I do think that it's out of date. But as you say, and as I told you, I think that the skill building part of it is still valid. It's still a good way to learn to interpret. But some of the vocabulary is out of date, and some of the content, this was all done before cell phones, let alone smartphones or the internet. So those are things that need to be incorporated. When I read murder mysteries, police detective procedurals, which I do a lot, and they're from the 90s, it's really evident that people don't have cell phones. They don't have the internet. They have to go find a phone booth. Well, that's the time when our materials were being developed. So they reflect that.
A fax machine, right?
Yeah. And my son and daughter-in-law now are running the company, Asebo. They're at aceboproducts.com if anybody wants to find it. And they have re-recorded things, they've updated things a little bit, but they're both very busy doing it in their spare time also. And they haven't updated things as much as I would like them to, but it's their business now. And I can't impose that on them. And if somebody else who's entrepreneurial out there wants to develop their own materials to compete with it, by all means, I welcome that, but I don't think that plagiarism is right. Occasionally people do just publish our materials without attribution, and we have to send them a letter. So yeah, sometimes there is plagiarism, and I don't agree with that. But if people want to set up a competing business, and some people have developed other material, and I know Agustin de la Mora does his own workshops with his own materials, and other interpreters and other schools do the same. That's fine. I have no problem with that. The more, the better.
And precisely, I'm so glad you spoke about attribution, because that's a really important, I think that's something really important, at least for me. I'm always very careful in my teachings that either to try and create original materials, or if we are using the Acebo materials, that we're working from a sanctioned copy, because it does take a lot of effort. It did take a lot of effort for you to create those materials and for them to be available all of these years later, and you should definitely be compensated for that. So do people actually contact you and say, hey, Holly, I'm going to be teaching this course, and I'd like to use these couple of exercises in this course, as long as it's there's attribution, would you be okay with that?
Yes, they do fairly often. And I tell them, go ahead and encourage your students to buy the materials, which they say they already do. And that's fine. It's a good advertisement.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. And we encourage everybody who's listening, anybody who has at one point or another obtained a bootleg copy of the Interpreter's Companion or the Interpreter's Edge, which we know they're out there. Of course, we know that they're out there. And they may be out there inadvertently. What I mean by that is that, for example, once upon a time, the Interpreter's Companion was only available in a paper format. So now it's available in a digital format. But between that time, somebody who might have wanted to have that copy that they themselves purchased in a paper copy, it turned into a digital format. They might have created their own digital format and then maybe, shared it around.
Yeah.
So it's just good for people to realize the amount of effort that goes into creating these materials.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't understand copyright law, which is very complex. But they think, well, if it's for educational purposes, I don't need to worry about copyright. That's not true. There are strict limits on how much of something you can use, even for educational purposes. So it's better to be safe than sorry, and make sure that you follow the law about using things with attribution and using only a small portion of something rather than reproducing the entire thing.
So with regards to teaching or training interpreters for tests, what has changed the most, would you say, in terms of the kinds of skills that you believe need to be taught to interpreters in order to sit and successfully pass these exams, whether it's a state or a federal exam? Have things changed during the entire time that you have been doing this?
No, I mean, the exams are much more professional than they were back in the 70s, more objective, and they are now based on recordings so that there can't be different versions of something for different candidates. Everybody is taking the same test and they're judged by the same standards, more or less. So that's an improvement, but I think interpreting is interpreting to a certain extent, and you still need to know how to interpret the three modes of interpreting accurately, and you still need to practice. I think overcoming test anxiety is something that wasn't recognized so much in the early years, and it was approached as more of a memorization technique rather than learning how to think and solve problems. And I think overcoming test anxiety is a big part of it, but also having confidence in your ability to solve problems is a key element of preparing for tests rather than just memorizing word lists. So the more that's recognized, the better people are prepared for the exams. But I think that in the courses come and go. Universities have a degree program for a while and then it dies because they lose the personnel or they lose the funding or something changes. Sometimes it's enmity, academic enmity and competition can be really vicious. So unfortunately, the courses come and go, but they do come. So they're popping up all over. I wish there were courses in more languages than Spanish. It's really demand driven. And in languages other than Spanish, they usually just don't have the numbers to justify it. But in some place like Southern California, they have viable courses in Vietnamese and Mandarin, Cantonese, that have continued to go on. And I imagine that in other regions, there are some other languages that justify running courses. But I don't think that much has changed in the exams per se, or in how you need to prepare for them.
Now, in addition to the exam preparation material, you are also known for being a prolific writer, particularly about issues that are practical for interpreters. And, you know, now that research in the interpreter field is coming of age, how do you distinguish between the type of writing that you have done, including, for example, a co-writing with other very seasoned interpreters, the fundamentals of court interpretation, and the type of writing that is required to, I guess, promote research in this area?
Well, fundamentals, the full title of it is Fundamentals of Court Interpretation, Theory, Policy, and Practice. And I was the practice part. In fact, Roseanne Gonzalez is primarily a policy person and a language person. She never worked as an interpreter, nor did Victoria Vasquez. Victoria was an attorney, I guess, and neither one of them ever worked as an interpreter, but they taught interpreters and established programs for interpreters. And one time there was an argument in the Supreme Court about the difference between translating and interpreting, and the final decision issued by the court quoted Gonzalez et al. And I was so proud. I was the et al. Who was quoted by
Congratulations. That's
Antonin
wonderful.
Scalia. Yeah, I'm et al. Anyway, that was a joint effort by people with expertise in different areas. And the second edition brought in even more experts in different areas of the field. I also wrote Introduction to Court Interpreting, which was my own very practical textbook, much thinner, that didn't have all the policy parts. It did cover the practice of interpreting in court and ethics and the role of the interpreter and a lot of that, but it was a little bit more practical in its approach. And my study materials were intended for people to work just on the skills. They didn't cover ethics or anything like that. The articles that I published in journals and newsletters were more informative. They were telling people about what court interpreters do, what they need to know, comparing the ethics of court interpreters to those of other types of interpreters, or bringing in the insights, for example, that healthcare interpreters had developed, and the distinction between the collaborative environment that healthcare interpreters, at least theoretically, work in, as opposed to the adversarial environment of the courtroom. So I wrote articles and analyzing that and looking at what court interpreters could learn and take away from what the healthcare interpreters were doing, or the same with sign language interpreters. They work in different environments, and so their needs are different, and the expectations, the standards are different. And I did a lot of analysis of what's different and what's the same about those different areas. So that's mostly what I wrote about.
Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about your experience in interpretation, but obviously you are also a translator, and you spent a lot of your life working as a translator. You were also awarded the ATA Alexander Goad Medal for Outstanding Service to the profession in 2011, which is actually only awarded every so often. So out of 57 years that it's been in existence, since 1964, it's only been awarded 41 times. So it's not like every year they're going to definitely award it to someone. But talk to us about a little bit about your experience and your background in translation, what you love about translation, so that those people who are listening to us who are interpreters and translators, those who might be interested in exploring translation a little bit, can get a sense of your passion for it.
Well, I did mention that I just love finding the mot juste, just that right way of saying something. I particularly like legal translation because the language is so convoluted, and there is a message in there. You just have to dig deep. And I really like sinking my teeth into something that is really hard to follow, but not impossible to follow. Although there are times it amazes me how sloppy some of the writing is in laws. And that's not just Spanish, that's English and probably other languages too. Legislation gets slammed together in committees and passed in the middle of the night, and nobody's really read it. So there isn't always pristine writing in laws, and court decisions can be that way too. But when it's really well written, it's just a real pleasure to be able to sort it out and then convey that message in a way that is clear and understandable to the reader. I think that what many interpreters, court interpreters in particular, don't understand about translation is that you do have a little more liberty with conveying meaning. You can take the time to convey what was intended, and you don't have that verbatim requirement of reflecting all of the errors and the infelicitous wording that you might hear in someone's statement. Well, sometimes there's infelicitous wording in written materials too, but you can clean some of that up, and justifiably so as a translator, as long as you're not inserting your own message or distorting the message. But I really enjoy the research involved in translation and the writing. I mean, I like to write, and you don't get to show that off as a court interpreter very much. So it's another outlet for my creative juices, I suppose, to be a translator.
I think that there's two things you have mentioned throughout this interview, which I find very, very interesting, because you mentioned that you're a very shy person. And you also spoke earlier about your limitations in terms of the Spanish language, and how over the years you took courses, you lived in Guatemala, you went to Mexico, and you really, went in there to perfect your language abilities. I think that, looking back at where you started and where you are now, and all of the time that has passed between, how do you reconcile, for example, your shyness with the idea of having to be a court interpreter who, in a certain way, although there's obviously a certain requirement to be unobtrusive, but you also have to be assertive, and you also have to be able to command the presence that allows for you to be able to do your work. So just a little bit about kind of the road that you've been on, and those things that you have really been challenged by over the years. Talk about that if you could.
Well, I think it's actually not unusual for introverts to be good public speakers, because you have something that you've prepared and you have a captive audience. What I really fear is boring people and having people just sort of wander away or not being able to get their attention. And that's why I avoid social situations. I don't like big parties or anything, because I can't think of anything to say. I can't get people's attention. If I'm in a crowded restaurant, nobody notices me. I go up to the counter at a store and they don't notice that I'm there because I'm short. So that aspect of social life is really challenging for me. But public speaking, and that includes court, even though I don't control what's being said, I'm speaking somebody else's words, so I don't have to worry about being boring, because it's not my fault if what they say is boring. So I don't own that message, and that's kind of a relief, I guess. And when I speak to conferences, I have, as I said, a captive audience. People are free to leave, but I have something that I think they want to hear, so I can deliver that message, and I have confidence about that. But my nightmares are all about trying to teach a class and nobody's listening and everybody's walking in and out of the room and I run out of things to say. That's the kind of thing that I worry about. But the public speaking aspect of court interpreting never bothered me that much. I always worried about making mistakes, misunderstanding something, not being able to come up with a word. But I think that's something that all interpreters worry about. And interpreters say that translators have all the time in the world and they can take forever to come up with the right wording, but that's not really true, because translations in the real world, in the business of translation, have to be delivered by deadlines, and often they're very unrealistic deadlines. So you don't have all the time in the world, but you have a certain amount of time, certainly more than an interpreter does. And I like that. I like being able to think things through and be sure I understand them before I convey that message.
When a student comes up to you who perhaps is not so sure of their language abilities in one or another language, do you, do you recommend that they practice their language skills through translation, or what do you say to them? Because it seems like I mean, you're living proof that you don't have to start at the peak of your language abilities to become a good interpreter or translator over time.
Well, I don't necessarily encourage them to practice translation if what they want to be is interpreters. But I encourage them to read, and to read very attentively in their weaker language, and read looking at questioning it all the time. Why did they phrase it this way and not that way? Why did they use that word and not this other word? And looking things up, and reading translations side by side, bilingual, if it's a good translation. And if you don't know very much, you don't know what's a good translation and what isn't. But if you look at professionally produced translations in the international organizations, everything is published multilingually. You can compare the different language versions and see what the translator did with the material. So I do encourage them to read a lot and to listen a lot, to build up their listening comprehension in their second language. If they are native Spanish speakers living in the US, they're surrounded by their second language and they're absorbing it constantly. If they are native speakers of English, and like me, they never lived abroad, they have to work harder to surround themselves with the language. I do live in California, which is practically a bilingual country, but I still have to go out of my way to hear Spanish. I read Spanish novels all the time. I read Spanish newspapers. I listen to Spanish podcasts and news broadcasts to keep up my Spanish. But it is something that I have to make an effort to do. And that is just a fact of life. If you want to be an interpreter, you need to keep working on your listening comprehension, reading comprehension in your second language without neglecting your first language, because it's easy to just forget what you used to know of your native language.
And of course, although you're using Spanish as an example because that is the language that you work with, this same methodology can be applied to any language, whether it's
Yes.
Vietnamese, Mandarin, Cantonese, French, German, Amharic, Tigrinya, etc.
Yes. Yes.
You just basically, it's the same procedure. You just have to be very meticulous about looking for good sources which are using a language that a high level of language that you can ensure that is grammatically correct, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the only problem with minority languages like Amharic and Tigrinya is that they aren't the languages of international organizations. You don't find a lot of published translations that you can compare, and it's not the language of governments or court systems necessarily. So it's a lot harder for them to find materials to work with. And I really admire the efforts they have to make to become accomplished translators and interpreters.
So when you're not giving interviews for podcasts or updating any of your numerous publications, what keeps you busy these days? I believe you're also still very active with the ATA. Is that correct?
Yes, I do work as a grader. I'm a deputy chair of the certification program, and I grade Spanish to English certification exams. I do translate as much as I can, but I just read all the time. I'm sort of a news junkie. I read a lot of news materials, mostly in English, but also Spanish. I'm now trying to read more in French and revive my moribund French. it's mainly a passive language. I have started practicing the piano again. I was always sort of an intermediate piano player. I could never play to entertain anybody. Nobody'd want to listen to it, but I do that to keep my brain active. And I work in my garden, and I hike, and I volunteer at the animal shelter, and just keep busy. I have 2 grandkids that I try to keep up with, although they're in San Diego, which is pretty far away, but that's what I do.
Well, it sounds like it's a pretty busy life. Do you have any closing words of wisdom for interpreters or translators who have been listening to this podcast?
No, just know that you are performing valuable work, and you're not going to be replaced by a machine anytime soon. It may happen someday, but not anytime soon. And I think that it's a lifelong learning experience to be a translator or interpreter. And it keeps your brain active. You're not as likely to be senile if you continue to use your languages all of your life.
Well, Holly Mikkelson, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We really appreciate it. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us today. Please share your comments with us on this platform or via email at podcast.delamorainstitute.com. And if you're listening to us, don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss our upcoming episodes. Never stop learning. Take care.